In 1835, a French novelist named Alexandre Dumas walked through the alleys of Naples and watched something that turned his stomach. Poor families, crouched over open-air stalls, were eating flattened discs of dough topped with whatever scraps the day's poverty allowed. A smear of tomato, a scattering of tiny fish, sometimes nothing more than lard, garlic, and salt. Dumas observed that you could read a Neapolitan family's fortune in the toppings on their pizza the way a broker reads a ticker tape. A bad week meant plain dough brushed with oil. A slightly better week meant tomato. A genuinely good week might bring a few anchovies or a scrap of cheese. Naples in the 1830s was one of the most overcrowded, most miserable cities in Europe, its population pushing past 400,000, with roughly a third of its residents living in what officials of the time politely called a state of destitution. Cholera would tear through the city's slums twice within the next 2 decades, killing thousands. And sitting right in the middle of all that suffering was a food so cheap, so scorned by the Italian upper classes, that wealthy Neapolitans considered it beneath contempt, unfit for a civilized table. Not gold, not spice, not silk. Flattened bread and tomato paste. A food so tied to poverty and squalor that for the better part of 3 centuries, respectable Italians would not go near it. Today, that same food is a roughly $150 billion global industry, ordered from a phone and delivered to a door faster than it once took a Neapolitan laborer to walk to the market. So how did the cheapest, most looked down upon street food in one of Europe's poorest cities become the single most eaten dish on the entire planet? This story does not actually start in Naples. It starts almost 6,000 years ago in the mudflats of the ancient Near East, with a discovery so basic that almost nobody thinks about it at all. Bread. Long before anyone had ever heard of Naples, or Italy, or tomatoes, human beings in the Fertile Crescent were learning to grind wild wheat and barley into paste, mix it with water, and cook it on hot stones. Archaeologists have found evidence of flatbread baking that stretches back roughly 10,000 years in regions that today are part of Iraq, Jordan, and Turkey. These early breads were not pizza in any recognizable sense. They were survival food, dense, cheap, and endlessly adaptable. You could bake them on a rock, on the inside wall of a clay oven, or directly in the ashes of a fire. No refrigeration, no complex tools, no waiting for anything to rise. Just grain, water, and heat. In a world without granaries or supermarkets, this was not a snack. It was the difference between a family eating through the winter and a family not making it to spring. The ancient world did not stop at plain bread for long. In ancient Egypt, records and tomb paintings show flatbreads baked with herbs and oils worked into the dough. In ancient Greece, a dish called plakis appears in the historical record, a flat round of bread brushed with olive oil, topped with herbs, garlic, and sometimes cheese. The Greek word for the region around Naples, incidentally, is where some etymologists trace part of the culinary lineage that would eventually produce Neapolitan cuisine, since Naples itself began life as a Greek colony called Neapolis, quite literally New City, founded around the 6th century BCE. The Romans took the idea further still. The statesman and writer Cato the Elder, in his agricultural manual written around 160 BCE, described a layered flatbread called placenta, baked with cheese and honey pressed between sheets of dough. It was not pizza, but it was close enough in concept, close enough in form, that food historians consider it a genuine ancestor. There is also a popular legend, often repeated, that Persian soldiers under King Darius the Great baked flatbread on their shields and topped it with cheese and dates during long marches. Historians are far less confident about that one. It shows up in later retellings without solid ancient sourcing, and most scholars treat it as a charming story rather than a documented fact. But the fact that people keep telling it tells you something important. The idea of flatbread plus topping, cooked fast, eaten on the move, was already ancient and already universal long before anyone in Naples ever touched a tomato. Here is a detail worth pausing on. The very word pizza itself shows up in the historical record far earlier than most people assume. The earliest known written use of the word appears in a Latin text from the year 997 from the town of Gaeta on the coast between Rome and Naples, in a document recording a rent payment owed to a local bishop, part of which was to be paid in the form of duodecim pizza, or 12 pizzas. That means the word predates the tomato, predates Christopher Columbus, predates the entire concept of an Italian nation by more than 500 years. Whatever that word originally described, it almost certainly was not the tomato-top dish people picture today. But a version of flatbread was already common enough in that region, common enough to be handed over as literal payment of debt nearly 1,000 years before Naples ever saw a single tomato plant. None of these ancient flatbreads were reserved for kings. That is the detail worth sitting with. Unlike wine, which the Roman elite obsessed over with vintage-level snobbery, or spices like pepper, which cost a fortune and signaled status, flatbread was food for everyone. Roman citizens received subsidized or free grain through a state program called the Annona, which at its height fed hundreds of thousands of people in the city of Rome alone. Flatbread was the delivery mechanism for that grain, cheap, filling, and about as unglamorous as food could get. It fed soldiers on campaign, it fed dock workers, it fed slaves and senators alike, in different forms, at different tables. This is where the deep pattern begins. From the very beginning, thousands of years before Naples existed as we know it, flatbread topped with whatever was available was always fundamentally poor people's food. It just had not met tomatoes yet. That meeting would take a very long time, and it would begin on an entirely different continent. Roughly 3,500 years ago, in what is now Mexico and Central America, indigenous peoples including the Aztec and Maya were cultivating a small, wild fruit they called tomato. It came in colors modern shoppers would find bizarre. Some were yellow, some were a deep, almost bruised purple. Some were tiny, no bigger than a berry. The Aztec used tomato in sauces, ground with chili peppers, a combination that still forms the backbone of much of Mexican cuisine today. For thousands of years, this plant existed entirely outside of European awareness. Then, in the early 1500s, Spanish conquistadors arriving in the Americas encountered it, and like so many crops from the so-called New World, it made the long ocean crossing back to Europe. Here is where the story takes its first genuinely strange turn. When tomatoes arrived in Europe in the 1520s and 1530s, almost nobody wanted to eat them. Botanists correctly identified the tomato as a member of the nightshade family, the same family that includes deadly, genuinely poisonous plants like belladonna and mandrake. That classification alone was enough to spook an entire continent. For decades, wealthy Europeans grew tomatoes purely as ornamental curiosities, admiring the fruit on the vine while refusing to put it anywhere near their mouths. There is also a more specific and rather absurd version of the poison scare that circulated among the European aristocracy. Wealthy households of the period ate off pewter plates, and pewter at the time contained a significant amount of lead. Tomatoes are acidic. When an acidic fruit sat on a lead-heavy pewter plate for any length of time, it could leach out enough lead to cause poisoning, sometimes fatal poisoning, in the people who ate off that plate. The aristocracy, eating their tomatoes on expensive pewter, sometimes did get sick or die. The poor, eating off cheap wooden plates that leached nothing, did not. So a genuine but completely misunderstood cause of death got blamed entirely on the tomato itself, and the fruit picked up a reputation as something dangerous that only reckless or desperate people would eat. Some German-speaking regions went even further, referring to the plant using terms that translate roughly to wolf peach, a name tied to older folklore about poisonous nightshades and werewolves alike. And no, that is not something anyone made up for effect. That is a documented, if darkly comic, piece of culinary history. One that food historians still cite as a case study in how correlation gets mistaken for causation. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains almost everything that follows. It was not scientific caution that got the tomato onto Italian tables first. It was poverty. The very people the aristocracy looked down on, the ones eating off splintered wooden plates instead of imported pewter, were, without knowing any of the chemistry involved, protected from the one danger the rich had actually stumbled into. In a strange, backwards way, being too poor to afford fashionable dishware may have been the single reason the tomato survived long enough in southern Italy to eventually meet a piece of flatbread at all. Because the poor had nothing to lose and cheap wooden dishes to eat off of, it was the poor of southern Italy, particularly around Naples, who first began cooking with tomatoes in any serious way. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, agricultural records from the Kingdom of Naples show tomatoes being grown and eaten regularly among the lower classes, folded into sauces, stewed with garlic and oil, and eventually spread across the flatbreads that Neapolitan street vendors had already been selling for generations. Think about that combination for a second. An ancient Near Eastern flatbread tradition, already thousands of years old, meets a New World fruit that the rich consider borderline poisonous, and the meeting point is the poorest neighborhoods of one of Europe's most crowded cities. That is not a glamorous origin story. It is the origin story anyway. By the 1700s, something recognizable as modern pizza was being sold on the streets of Naples, from portable ovens and small storefronts to dock workers, laborers, and the urban poor, collectively known as the lazzaroni. These were people who often lacked kitchens of their own, who worked long, physically brutal hours, and who needed food that was cheap, filling, fast, and eaten standing up or on the move. Pizza filled that need perfectly. Vendors folded it, wrapped it, sold it by the slice for pennies. It was, in the most literal sense, fast food centuries before the term existed. And it was despised by exactly the people you would expect. Wealthy Neapolitans and the broader Italian upper class considered pizza vulgar, greasy, and a marker of low birth. Guidebooks from the period aimed at genteel travelers sometimes warned visitors away from street pizza entirely, treating it less as a regional specialty and more as a hygiene risk to be avoided. This was not a niche opinion. It was the mainstream one. Pizza carried the stigma of poverty for well over a century, and for most of Italy, most of the time, it stayed exactly where it started, in the poorest streets of a single southern city. If you are finding this interesting so far, go ahead and hit subscribe now. This channel covers stories exactly like this every week, tracing the hidden history behind the food, objects, and commodities you interact with every single day. And you will not want to miss what is coming later in this one. Because the next turn in Pizza's story is where things start to genuinely surprise people. The turning point most commonly told, and the one that gave pizza its most famous variety, involves a queen. In 1889, according to a widely repeated story, Queen Margherita of Savoy, wife of King Umberto I, visited Naples and requested to try the local street food that so many of her subjects apparently loved. A Neapolitan pizzaiolo, a pizza maker, named Raffaele Esposito, working at a pizzeria called Pizzeria di Pietro, later renamed Brandy, is said to have prepared several pizzas for the royal visit. One of them was topped simply with tomato, mozzarella, and basil, deliberately arranged to mirror the red, white, and green of the newly unified Italian flag. The Queen reportedly loved it, and the pizza was named Margherita in her honor. Whether every detail of this story is historically accurate remains genuinely debated among food historians. Some point out that the tricolor combination of tomato, mozzarella, and basil likely already existed in Naples before 1889, and that the royal endorsement, if it happened at all, simply attached a memorable name and a flattering origin story to something pizzaiolos were already making. But here is the detail that makes the debate almost beside the point. Whether the Queen's visit unfolded exactly as the legend claims or not, the Margherita pizza did emerge from this period, it did take its name from the Queen, and it did mark one of the very first moments any part of the Italian aristocracy publicly associated itself with a dish that had spent roughly 3 centuries as food for the poor. A single royal visit, real or embellished, cracked open a door that 300 years of stigma had kept firmly shut. That crack would not turn into anything close to global fame from within Italy itself, though. It took an ocean crossing, a wave of desperate migration, and a period of ugly, often violent prejudice to set pizza on its path toward the rest of the world. Between 1880 and 1920, roughly 4 million Italians immigrated to the United States, the overwhelming majority of them from the poorer regions of southern Italy, including Naples and the surrounding Campania region. They arrived carrying almost nothing, except in many cases the recipes and food traditions of home. And what they encountered in America was not a warm welcome. Italian immigrants, especially those from the South, were frequently viewed by the existing American population as a different and lesser racial category entirely, associated in the press and in public rhetoric with crime, disease, and an inability to assimilate. This was not merely social friction. In March of 1891, in New Orleans, a mob lynched 11 Italian immigrants following the acquittal of several men accused without solid evidence of murdering the city's police chief. It remains one of the largest mass lynchings in American history, and its victims were targeted specifically because they were Italian. National newspapers at the time largely defended the lynching rather than condemning it, and no one was ever prosecuted for the killings. This was not an isolated incident either. Italian immigrants across the country, but especially those from the South, were frequently classified on official immigration and census paperwork in ways that separated them from Northern Europeans, treated by prevailing racial theories of the era as a distinct and inferior category, rather than simply as fellow white Europeans. They were crowded into some of the most overcrowded, poorly ventilated tenement housing in cities like New York and Chicago, faced routine discrimination in hiring, and were frequently blamed in the press for crime and disease regardless of actual evidence. Pizza, and Italian food more broadly, arrived in America wrapped in exactly this climate of suspicion and hostility. For decades, it stayed almost entirely inside Italian immigrant neighborhoods, sold in small storefronts to homesick countrymen, virtually unknown and largely unwanted outside those communities. It was not unusual for pizza to be described in mainstream American newspapers of the early 20th century as a strange, garlicky foreign curiosity, something to be regarded with amusement or suspicion rather than appetite. This was not a footnote. This was pizza's second long stretch as an outsider's food, first scorned by Italy's own upper class, and then scorned again in a new country by people who saw the immigrants who made it as unwelcome altogether. The first documented licensed pizzeria in the United States opened in 1905, when a baker named Gennaro Lombardi received a license to sell pizza from his grocery store on Spring Street in Manhattan's Little Italy. For the next several decades, pizzerias like Lombardi's remained essentially an ethnic curiosity, a food eaten almost exclusively by Italian Americans and viewed by much of the wider population, if they had heard of it at all, as strange, greasy, and foreign. This is where the story takes a turn nobody in Naples and almost nobody in America would have predicted. World War II sent hundreds of thousands of American soldiers to fight across the Italian peninsula between 1943 and 1945. Stationed in and around cities like Naples, many of these young men, most of whom had never eaten pizza in their lives, encountered it for the first time in bombed-out cafes and makeshift kitchens near the front lines. They came home with a taste for it. And in the years immediately following the war, pizza consumption in the United States began climbing in a way it never had before, driven overwhelmingly by veterans who wanted to recreate something they had eaten overseas. This is the part of pizza's history that does not get nearly enough credit. Cultural taste alone does not turn a food into an industry. Machinery does. In 1945, an inventor and entrepreneur named Ira Nevin developed a gas-fired pizza oven, a major improvement over the coal and wood-burning ovens that had defined Neapolitan pizza baking for 2 centuries. Nevin's company, which would eventually be known as Baker's Pride, made it dramatically cheaper and faster to open a pizzeria almost anywhere in the country, without needing a wood supply, a coal chimney, or years of specialized training to manage the fire. Around the same period, food scientists working with the American dairy industry developed low-moisture part-skim mozzarella, a version of the cheese engineered specifically to melt evenly, hold up under high heat, and survive shipping and storage in a way that traditional fresh mozzarella made from water buffalo milk simply could not. Fresh mozzarella spoils in days. The new industrial mozzarella could sit on a shelf, travel across state lines, and still perform exactly the way a pizzeria owner needed it to. Between the gas oven and the shelf-stable cheese, pizza went from a dish that required Neapolitan-level specialization to one that a motivated entrepreneur with modest capital could replicate almost anywhere in America. And Americans took that opportunity and ran with it, fast. In 1958, two brothers named Dan and Frank Carney borrowed $600 from their mother, worth roughly $6,500 in today's money, and opened a single pizza restaurant in Wichita, Kansas, that they called Pizza Hut. 2 years later, in 1960, a man named Tom Monahan bought a single pizza shop in Ypsilanti, Michigan, with his brother for $500 down. That shop would eventually become Domino's Pizza. Monahan's central insight was not about the pizza itself so much as about speed. Domino's built its entire early business model around fast, reliable delivery, eventually promising pizza in 30 minutes or less, or the customer's money back. That guarantee turned into a legal and public relations problem by the early 1990s, after a string of accidents involving delivery drivers speeding to meet the deadline, and the company dropped the guarantee entirely in 1993. But by then, the underlying idea, pizza as something delivered fast, directly to your door, had permanently reshaped what pizza meant in American life. Meanwhile, in home kitchens, a new category was exploding. Frozen pizza, pioneered commercially in the late 1950s by companies including Celentano and later Totino's, founded by Rose Totino, meant that pizza no longer required a restaurant, a delivery driver, or even a working oven timer more sophisticated than the one already built into a home stove. Pizza had officially become, in the span of about 15 years, one of the cheapest, fastest, and most accessible foods in the entire country that had once tried to lynch the people who brought it there. From that point forward, the growth curve only bends upward. American pizza chains began expanding internationally starting in the 1960s and 1970s, and by the 1980s and 1990s, pizza was undergoing a strange kind of re-export. The dish that started as poor Neapolitan street food, got adopted and industrialized by American chains, was now being sold back to the rest of the world, often in forms a Neapolitan pizzaiolo from the 1700s would not recognize at all. Domino's opened its first store in Japan in 1985. And Japanese menus eventually featured toppings like corn, mayonnaise, and squid, combinations that would have baffled both the original Neapolitan street vendors and the mid-century American chain founders equally. In Brazil, pizza became enormously popular, with toppings ranging from hearts of palm to hard-boiled egg to, in some regions, chocolate and banana on dessert pizzas. In India, paneer and tandoori chicken pizza became standard menu items at major chains. Pizza had stopped being Italian, stopped being purely American, and become something closer to a universal template, a blank canvas that virtually every food culture on the planet felt free to paint over according to its own taste. Today, the numbers involved are almost difficult to process. The global pizza market is valued at roughly $150 billion annually, and in the United States alone, pizza sales account for tens of billions of dollars a year, spread across more than 70,000 pizzerias, a number that does not even include the pizza sold through grocery stores, gas stations, and school cafeterias. Americans are commonly estimated to eat something in the range of 350 slices of pizza every single second. 350 slices every second. In 2017, the United Nations Cultural Agency UNESCO added the art of Neapolitan pizzaiolos, the traditional skill of hand-spinning and wood-fire baking pizza in Naples, to its list of intangible cultural heritage, a formal global recognition of a craft that less than 2 centuries earlier, wealthy Italians would not have wanted mentioned at their own dinner table. The United States alone is estimated to consume roughly 3 billion pizzas every single year, an average that works out to something in the range of 23 pounds of pizza per person annually across the entire population, infants included. Pizza Hut, Domino's, and Little Caesars alone operate a combined total of tens of thousands of locations across more than 100 countries, and Domino's in particular has grown into one of the largest fast food companies on earth by store count, built almost entirely on a single insight about speed that a man in Michigan had with 500 borrowed dollars in 1960.
But pizza is far more than just food at this point, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. During periods of major national crisis in the United States, journalists and government watchers have, only half-jokingly, tracked pizza delivery activity around federal buildings in Washington as an informal indicator that something significant is happening behind closed doors. This so-called Pentagon Pizza Index has been referenced by reporters and analysts around moments including the build-up to the Gulf War in 1990 and other periods of late-night crisis meetings, on the simple logic that officials working through the night order food, and pizza is what gets ordered. In 2001, in an entirely different kind of curveball, Pizza Hut paid to have its logo printed on a Russian Proton rocket, and separately arranged for a specially prepared pizza to be delivered to astronauts aboard the International Space Station, making it, by most accounts, the first food product delivered to space specifically as a piece of paid corporate advertising. A dish that started as scraps of dough and tomato sold to dock workers for pennies had within roughly 2 centuries become something that shows up on rockets and gets tracked as a geopolitical signal. It was there, in the mudflats of the ancient Near East, as bread that kept entire communities alive through the winter. It was there in Rome, feeding senators and slaves alike off the same basic recipe. It was there in Naples, scorned by the wealthy, sold for pennies to the lazzaroni, judged so harshly that guidebooks warned travelers away from it. It was there when a queen may or may not have tasted it and gave it a name that stuck forever. It was there when Italian immigrants carried it across an ocean into a country that met them with suspicion, and in New Orleans, with a rope. It was there when American soldiers found it in the ruins of a war-torn country and could not stop thinking about it once they got home. It was there when a gas oven and a piece of engineered cheese turned a centuries-old craft into something almost anyone could replicate. And it is there right now, quite possibly sitting in a box on your kitchen counter or waiting on an app for a driver to bring it to your door, having traveled from Mesopotamian riverbanks to Aztec fields to Neapolitan slums to a rocket bound for space. Not bad for a food that upper-class Italians once considered too disgusting to put on a plate. If any part of this surprised you, let me know which part in the comments, because pizza's history has more strange turns in it than almost any food this channel has covered. And if you want more stories like this one, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we have a lot more of them coming, and I will see you in the next one.